South today's panel discussion. Today we'll be discussing the impact of COVID-19 pandemic on international relations from a Southern perspective. I would like to start at first by welcoming all our eminent panelists, Professor Upadhyay, former professor and head Department of Humanities and Social Sciences at IIT Delhi, Professor Sriparna Pathak, Assistant Professor and Assistant Dean, Academic Dean at Jindal School of International Affairs at OP Jindal Global University in Haryana, India, and Professor Ritusha Tiwari, Visiting Fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies in Delhi. So today our eminent speakers or panelists, they are going all to talk about these related issues to COVID-19 and COVID-19 crisis and its relationship to international relations, or how it has impacted the international relations, especially in southern countries. So I would like, before starting, to tell all our panelists that by the name of Jindal Centre for the Global South, I really appreciate that you have accepted our invitation and you are here with us today. So it is really a great pleasure and honor to have you all with us today. So we shall start by our session today, our panel discussion today, by first the presentation of our three respected panelists, and then we will move to the Q&A section, which is going to be at the end of this webinar. So each presentation is going to take around 30 minutes. I request please, all the attendees to mute, to make sure that they have muted their mic and their camera is as well turned off. And please write down your questions in the chat box at the end of the presentations, mentioning the name of the panelists that you are inquiring, or write between two brackets that this question is to all panelists, as if it is a general question. So now starting by our first eminent guest speaker, Professor Upadhyay, that I have in my presentation, in my first talk, tells that he is a former professor and head of the Department of Humanities and Social Sciences in IIT Delhi. So I will give a few like a briefing of Professor Upadhyay for those who doesn't know him, who don't know him. So he has earlier taught at many universities inside and outside India. In India, like IIT Kanpur and University of Rajasthan. Outside India, in Canada, in New Brunswick and McMaster universities in Canada. He is a member of the Streaming Council of the World Association of Political Economy. He has published about 100 research papers in reputed Indian and international journals. He has authored, edited several books on the subjects of Indian economy and political economy. His research interest is development economics and political economy. And today, Professor Upadhyay will share with us his expert opinion on the impact of coronavirus crisis on global power balance, implication for emerging multipolarity in world order. So I'm giving you now, Professor Upadhyay, the talk. So you may start your talk, please. Thank you. Please unmute your mic. Unmute your mic.
Okay, is it okay now? Can you hear me now?
Yes. Yes, it is perfect.
Thank you very much for giving me a chance to speak in this very important panel discussion on the impact of this pandemic globally, especially how it affects the relationship between the developed countries and developing countries, global north and global south. My topic of talk today is impact of coronavirus on global power balance, implications for the emerging multipolarity in world order. Basically, I will be talking about economic issues, global economic issues. I will be focusing more on the United States because it matters more, and will try to draw some implications of this particular disease, that what impact it has and how it affects the global economic order. And then I will take up geopolitical issues in the sense that what is the impact of these changes in global economic power balance on the relationships between different countries, especially since we are focusing on the countries of South, so how it affects them and that way. Normally, I speak extempore, but this particular webinar method actually is new, so I'll try to read my paper. It will take about 20 minutes to complete this thing. All right? Hello? So it's fine? Yeah.
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 Yes, that's fine.
Yeah. Yeah. So COVID-19 is a strange phenomenon. In some respects, it pushes us 5 to 10 years back, but in other respects, it pushes us 5 to 10 years ahead. So I will discuss both these dimensions in my talk today. There have been many pandemics in the past, but never before the world's reaction to a pandemic has been like this time. The worldwide panic reaction to COVID-19 has no parallel in history. Every country has responded to this health crisis with measures that have paralyzed life continuously for many months. Many nations imposed curfew-like lockdowns, which completely constrained all aspects of life, bringing economic, social, and political activities to a virtual standstill. In this talk, I will focus on globally significant economic and political effect of prolonged lockdowns. Panic reaction to the health crisis led to government almost everywhere to impose restrictions on people's movement. People were asked not to venture out of their houses for months and maintain social distancing. In many countries, these restrictions were very strict and draconian. As a result, economic activities there collapsed completely within a space of few days. In the US, for example, a near full employment economy in the early months of 2020 grinded to halt in a matter of a few weeks, rendering almost 40 million workers jobless. The rate of unemployment reached 1930s depression level of about 25%. There are forecasts that 10 to 15% decline in GDP will take place in this particular year. Many countries in Europe, Latin America, Asia and Africa face a similar situation of massive unemployment and loss of income and livelihood. But the effect of the pandemic on the Chinese economy has been quite limited. In the January to March quarter, Chinese economy shrank by 6.8%. But in the April to June quarter, it has shown a growth of 3.2%. Chinese economy is the only major economy expected to register positive growth this year. This has huge implications for the global power balance. The gap between the US and China GDP will see a significant reduction due to this uneven impact of pandemic on these countries. In a normal course, this level of gap reduction would have taken several years to materialize. The significance of this development has not been lost on American policymakers. In words of US Attorney General Bill Barr, I'm quoting him, the People's Republic of China is now engaged in an aggressive whole of government and indeed whole of society campaign to seize commanding heights of the global economy and to surpass United States as the world's preeminent technological superpower. So this is my first point, that there was a gap in GDP as we measured by usual method. For example, in case of China, the GDP total GDP about 14 trillion. In America, it will be about 21 million. But if suppose you have a 10% decline in American GDP and some increase in Chinese economy, so then this gap will be significantly reduced in a just matter of 1 year. Otherwise, it would have taken several years. So that really changes the balance, global balance of power in economic terms quite a bit. The path of economic recovery depends on many factors. Even after the lockdown are lifted, the economy may take several years to reach the pre-COVID levels. For example, in case of America, they are talking of depression type situation. Some people are even using a term greater depression, meaning actually much more serious situation even compared to the depression of 1930s. So it may take several years to come back to the level that was before this crisis, COVID-19 crisis. There are many sectors in the economy, such as air travel, tourism, hotels, restaurants, major sports events, that may never see a full recovery. In that sense, some parts of the economy might be lost permanently. The health crisis is also likely to alter people's consumption and saving behavior. Excessive consumption on the part of the people is an essential requirement of the functioning of present capitalist system. But psychological effects caused by the fearful experience of health crisis are now certain to make people much more risk averse. This is certain to dampen the pace of capital accumulation and in turn reduce the capitalist economy's growth potential. So this is one important point I'm trying to make, that the difference that was there between two major economies, the biggest economy, China, America, so that's reduced. So that changes the balance of power in that sense. But the next quite important question actually I'm trying to state here is that, so this is also a question of legitimacy of fiat money and future of dollars hegemony in global economic affairs and so on. So the burden of economic downfall has fallen mostly on poorer sections of the society. It is mostly the poor people, low-wage earners who have seen their job disappearing and their lives shattered overnight. Millions of people across nations have been pushed into extreme poverty due to lockdowns. Different countries have adopted varying measures to mitigate the downside effects of lockdown. US, Canada, and many European countries have announced huge fiscal stimulus packages with the aim to lessen the sufferings of people and businesses hurt due to the prolonged lockdowns. The purpose of these rescue measures is to put the economy back on a path of revival and growth. Many countries have made extensive use of expansionary monetary policy. Expansionary monetary policy meaning actually easy credit, what's referred to as quantitative easing or easy monetary policy. Central banks in these countries have reduced key interest rates to near zero, and in some countries benchmark interest rates have moved into negative zone. Implications of these easy money policies go far beyond the immediate effects on revival path of the economies. The liberal use of money expansion, puts a question mark on the integrity and soundness of fiat money in many Western capitalist economies. Excessive increase in money supply can lead to inflationary pressure. And if suppose the growth in real economy is not really that much. So suppose real economy is not growing and we are increasing money supply at a rapid rate. So normal outcome of this kind of policy is to rate of inflation in the economy. So that has actually effect on the value of currency. For example, in US, the value of dollar declines if suppose that happens. So this can erode the value of money rapidly. But more importantly, it needs to be understood that infusion of large quantities of money in the economy is hardly ever distributionally neutral. So it also has distributional effect. In some sections it benefits and other factors it really causes problems. The experience of Western economies in recent decades, that is actually even after the crisis, earlier crisis, recessionary crisis of 2008, that has been the experience. So similar kind of situation may develop again here, that large money infusion works primarily to enhance wealth of the richer sections in the society. I give some details about US policies because that's actually very important thing here. The US government has launched $2 trillion worth of stimulus package, and there are plans to borrow more money for this purpose. The Federal Reserve has taken its quantitative easing policies to new heights, meaning actually reducing rate of interest. It has undertaken unprecedented measures to support the economy. The Federal Reserve promises to buy any amount of treasury bonds issued by the US government for the purpose of financing the rescue package, meaning actually any amount of government, US government wants to borrow, the Federal Reserve will lend them this money. It is de facto monetization of fiscal deficit. This method, guided by insights of modern monetary theory, is also referred to as printing of money. This is called printing of money, meaning actually giving money to the government to spend. So normally it's not done in normal course of time, but they are resorting to this particular method in a very big way. So this, the Federal Reserve has extended bond buying activity much beyond the usual things they do, like buy the government bonds. They have now shown willingness to buy even corporate bonds and even actually what is called junk bonds. So not only the Fed is ready to supply money to the US government, it's also giving money to the companies, private companies, by buying their bonds. The main beneficiaries of US assistance program have been large corporations, especially blue chip companies. The rescue schemes have worked largely to prop up financial markets. For example, the rise in stock markets these days they are seeing, it's because of this particular phenomena that big companies are getting a lot of money from the Federal Reserve, their central bank, and they have no other way of spending that money. There's no investment activity. So most of that money actually is going to the stock market. So the quantitative easing policies pursued by Federal Reserve have significantly increased wealth inequalities in the US. So this is a very important point actually here. So all these policy measures, rescue measures that government is undertaking with the help of the Federal Reserve, they are leading to increased inequalities in the economy. Now, there's a question actually, is there a limit to printing of money? What is the significance of soundness and integrity of money in the functioning of modern capitalist system? How much actually money supply we can increase? How much money we can print? When does it affect the working of the economy? It is quite likely that at some stage, people will lose faith in fiat money. If money supply growth loses connection with the pace of the real economy. Suppose real economy does not grow, you have depression or recessionary conditions, and money supply keeps on increasing. So at some point, people will say that what is happening? They may actually lose faith. The dollar, for example, may lose value in that respect. This is a phenomenon that occurs quite often in developing countries. Many countries actually see this thing happening quite often. Advanced capitalist countries with hard currencies have so far been able to avoid this fate in the post-war period. By post-war, but in the aftermath of the depression caused by COVID-19, as they are saying that the depressionary condition, even the advanced capitalist economies cannot be immune from the dangers of what we call stagflation, of a runaway inflation. The loss of faith in fiat currency in advanced capitalist countries will have both domestic as well as international repercussions. As discussed before, the massive infusion of money in the economy by large-scale printing of fiat money has distributional consequences. As I said earlier, actually, it causes inequality. In the US, additional money so created has largely gone to the rich people. It obviously raises a question in the minds of common people that money can be created so easily and be given to the rich people. Then why do they have to pay taxes? And why can't money be created from thin air and be given to them? The recent Black Lives Matter, that protest in the US and elsewhere in several European countries and other places have witnessed unprecedented level of intensity and anger. Certainly, one important factor behind it has been the realization on the part of common people how unjust the ruling class's response to the COVID-19 crisis has been. Meaning actually all what they have done is to give money to the rich people, to the rich companies, corporates and so on, little bit to the common people, but mostly to the richer sections. So now this question of printing so much money without regard to that's what's happening in the real economy has, this implication that even domestically, people may at certain point lose faith in the soundness of money, meaning actually they may see that value of dollar may decline. But more than that, actually, since we are discussing the international aspect, it also has impact on dollar's hegemony globally. Now, this is a subject of debate now that current instance of the US monetary policy of excessive quantitative easing may cause severe damage to the dollar's status as the world reserve currency. We all know that dollar is the reserve currency in the world today. For 75 years since the end of World War II, the status of the US dollar as the primary global currency has continued virtually uncontested. There has been no actually any parallel currency giving any challenge to dollar during all these years after Second World War. About 60% of the world currency reserve are in dollars, and the vast majority of global trade and investment takes place in dollars. In comparison, only about 20% of global currency reserves are in euros. The US has been running consistent trade and current account deficits. Trade means actually export-import deficit, and current account deficit, and also their domestic deficit with the rest of the world over the past 4 decades. The dollar's world reserve currency status allows the US to borrow from the rest of the world large sums of money. United States has largest external debt in the world. In 2018, foreigners owned $6.2 trillion of US debt. Excessive printing of money by Federal Reserve as a response to the COVID-19 crisis is likely to instill fear among the United States foreign lenders. This is because excessive increase in money supply could lead to high inflation, causing a sharp decline in the value of dollar. US government's rescue package running into trillions of dollars is largely being financed from borrowings from the Federal Reserve. This is an indication of the changes in the foreign perception of United States strength, which over time will cause erosion in dollar's hegemonic status. Earlier, actually, a lot of US government, for example, used to borrow from outside, but this time all this borrowing that is being done internally from Federal Reserve itself. So there's not really much outside borrowing. So this is also a change in that respect, that outside lenders may not be willing to lend to America. Suppose they see that future of dollar is not that really certain. So of course, there are other geopolitical developments happening at the same time that are also contributing to this phenomena of declining power of the US dollar. The developing Cold War between US and China is a major factor among them. In recent years, America has been very aggressive in using its currency's power to impose sanctions on countries with whom it has any disagreement or dispute. It is forcing not only its rivals, but also allies to explore other options. It is true that replacement of dollar by some other currency at the world reserve currency does not appear likely in the near future. In the near future, actually, we don't see that any currency. Euro has not been able to do it, nor actually the Chinese currency yuan is in a position to replace dollar. So something that is called there's no alternative, TINA argument. So that argument is actually quite important, but there are other ways in which domination of dollar is coming under challenge. In past few years, many countries, including China and Russia, are making attempts towards de-dollarization of their economies, meaning actually they are reducing the use of dollars in their economies. These countries are diversifying their foreign exchange reserve and conducting trade transactions in other reserve currencies, for example, euro, or in their own national currencies. This trend toward de-dollarization has been underway for many years now and is likely to accelerate because of the large-scale use of quantitative easing policies by the Federal Reserve. So the point I'm trying to make is that although some things are already happening, de-dollarization is already happening, but given that what kind of pressures actually this particular pandemic has generated in terms of what is happening inside US, the printing of money and so on. So that may accelerate this process of de-dollarization. As mentioned earlier, in comparison to the US, the Chinese economy is doing much better. So that also will be a factor actually which will accelerate use of other currencies, the process of de-dollarization. Now, these fast-paced changes will instill fear in the US, which is a declining power, fearing loss of hegemonic control over world. So this is my point actually, that so many things are happening and so much change is there in the balance, economic balance globally and so on. So that creates actually some sort of panic, they may create a panic reaction in the US that they have to safeguard their position and do something about it. As acts of desperation, the US is likely to take steps to check Chinese rights. These steps include enhanced trade war, alliance formation, and even military moves. There's one very other important thing here is that this crisis, health crisis, provides a ready opportunity to globally isolate China by blaming China for the origin of the disease. Many countries from Asia, Africa have been willing to join the US and Europe in condemning China for this sin. The regions may, however, be quite different. These countries had seen their economies suffer heavily due to the health crisis, and they are not in a position to repay Chinese debt. These countries have joined the China blaming game in order to seek deferment of loan repayments. Now, I come to the political aspect of this thing. The questions about how the global order is being affected. There's a growing general consensus that about for 200 years long period, Western domination of the world is coming to an end and a new world order is emerging. How does COVID-19 crisis affect world order or the pace of change? Important question here is, will the pandemic push the world towards bipolarity, or will it strengthen the present trend toward multipolarity that is emerging? So the question I'm trying to pose is that what's going to likely to happen? Is multipolarity will be strengthened or be moved towards a bipolar world? Bipolarity in today's context means that world gets divided into two warring camps, one led by the US, another by the China. In my view, this is not a realistic possibility in today's circumstances. I give actually two reasons for that. One is that we know that there are two major powers now, we can call them superpowers, the US and China, but there are also other powerful nations and blocs, such as Russia, Europe, Japan, and India, who stands to lose their independence if the world turns bipolar. If suppose we move towards bipolarity, then we will be assigned to one of these camps. So that way, the independence of these major power centers, that also gets affected. For example, Russia is very important. Like Soviet Union during the Cold War era, Russia today is able to provide counterbalance to the US and other Western powers in military terms. Despite very close strategic alliance with China, Russia is the main proponent of multipolarity in world relations. Russia has acted very forcefully and very decisively against Western designs in many places, such as Syria. There are many countries, such as Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, who are victims of US aggression in the form of economic sanctions and even threat of direct military action. And all these countries actually look forward for some kind of help from Russia, either at the United Nations Security Council or in some other forums. Europe and Japan enjoy close economic relations with China, which are mutually beneficial to all of them. Europe and Japan will therefore be wary of aligning too closely with the US in its attempt at containing China. The American alliance with the Western Europe is also not as strong as it once was. So this is one point. The another important point actually why, the possibility of the globe turning bipolar is not that much. So the second reason I have is that both US and China may not be very enthusiastic about being the poles. By being a pole, a country derives many benefits by virtue of its dominant position, but it also has associated cost. The polarity actually also has cost here. The Soviet Union could not bear the burden of being a pole for very long and disintegrated due to internal pressures. The Trump administration probably sees cost of being pole outweighing the benefits. The Trump administration, they probably sees that this responsibility of being a pole is very costly. Similarly, now actually that situation may change if suppose Trump loses election and we have this Democratic candidate Joe Biden, suppose he becomes the president. So there may be some attempts to change this present situation. Similarly, in the Chinese case, actually, the China too is also not ready to this role of leadership. It lacks the strength to take up the position at the second pole. Now, the last thing actually, I come here that what does all this leave? Where does all this leave India? India's prestige in the global community has diminished somewhat in the past few years. The main reason for this has been a significant decline in its economic strength. Our governments own some missteps, demonetization and GST, led to considerable slowdown in India's GDP growth. But the panic reaction to this pandemic in terms of severe lockdowns has created conditions of depression, pushing the economy backward by several years. We still don't know actually the impact. Things are emerging. But again, like very easily, I mean, there will be negative growth of 10% again more. So we are talking about a situation which sort of resembles the situation of depression period. Despite these setbacks, India continues to maintain a significant position at world stage. This is largely due to its potential to become a major global power someday in the future. The potential still remains. Now, some very specific points. During the last 3 years of Modi rule, there have been almost 2 coup-like attempts to force the government to abandon its foreign policy based on the principle of strategic autonomy. I mean, there have been attempts that this talk about independent foreign policy, strategic autonomy, that should be given up. One was at the time of Doklam and other was during the Galwan standoff. Concerted efforts were made by a section of BJP, RSS, almost all opposition parties, whole of the media, both TV and print, to push India completely into the US camp. 2 countries, Britain and Australia, are already there in that camp. But so far, these attempts don't appear to have succeeded. India still remains a member of BRICS and SCO, despite the demand by certain pro-American forces in India to pull out of these organizations. Last thing I want to talk about is that this, however, does not mean that India's foreign policy stance has not undergone any change in recent years. Increasing military purchases from the US and membership of the Quad. Quad means actually this organization of 4 countries, America, Japan, Australia, and India. India is being a member. So these things indicate a pro-US shift in India's foreign policy. There's growing perception in many capitals that India has not been able to maintain its independent status, as it is not able to stand up to the US pressure. Under US pressure, India stopped energy imports from Iran, which was the 3rd largest supplier of oil. In retaliation, Iran has cancelled India's participation in an important rail link project, and India also has been cut out of development of an LNG gas field. But the last point, Russia still remains a major supporter of India's policy of strategic autonomy. Russia is still the most important and most reliable supply of high-end military hardware to India. At the height of Galwan standoff with China, the first country Defense Minister Rajnath Singh visited was Russia. India, now the last point is that India's strength in geopolitical affairs is of high significance. If India moves very close to the US camp, it pushes the world towards a dangerous situation of bipolarity. It is therefore very important to pay close attention to the India's foreign policy moves. Thank you very much. That's on it.
Okay, thank you so much, Professor Upadhyay, for your enlightening and insightful presentation on the impact of coronavirus crisis on world economy and global economic and political power balance. Now we are moving to, we shall move to our second part of our presentation section today with Professor Sriparna. I ask please all the attendees to make sure that their mic is switched off. So now we are, as I was saying, we are moving to the second part of the presentation section with Professor Sriparna Pathak. So as I was presenting her in the first presentation, she is assistant professor and assistant academic dean at School of International Affairs at Upadhyay Global University. She has awarded a doctorate degree from the Center for East Asian Studies, the Jawaharlal Nehru University in 2015. She has also been a recipient of the Joint Fellowship awarded by the Ministry of Human Resources Development, India and China Scholarship Council, Government of the People's Republic of China. She is a fellow at the South Asia Democratic Forum in Brussels, Belgium. She was working as well as a consultant and the policy planning and research division at the Ministry of External Affairs in New Delhi. She has also worked as observer research with the Observer Research Foundation in Kolkata and New Delhi, respectively, and the UNICEF India and the Center for Armed Forces Historical Research in New Delhi. Her main areas of interest are China's domestic economy, trade and economic relations between India and China, and China's foreign policy and economic linkages with the world. So today, Professor Sriparna will share with us her expert opinion, the Chinese economy and its rebooting process during the COVID-19 pandemic. So now I'm giving the talk. Please, you may start, Professor Sriparna.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Professor Heba and Jindal Centre for Global South for organizing this timely and brilliant discussion. I'm going to present basically on rebooting the Chinese economy during a pandemic. Why do I talk about China? Well, because as Professor Upadhyay has already said, China is one of the two great powers in the current international system. And as he has already said, this COVID-19, beyond the impact it has produced on the public health system and economies worldwide, it's also impacting international relations. So before we go into understanding what kind of impacts are being created on international relations, it becomes pertinent to look at China and the kind of impacts China has had so far, so that we can, then move on to understanding where China could possibly be headed. So in this COVID-19 world order, what we are also increasingly seeing is that there are these new forms of diplomacy which are coming out from China, be it in the form of aid diplomacy, be it in the form of medical diplomacy, face mask diplomacy, wolf warrior diplomacy. So China is increasingly trying to position itself as the leader of the international system. As Western liberal economies led by the United States, they become increasingly insular and they start looking inwards to grapple with their own issues created by the pandemic. And the most recent example of this is, the announcement that Donald Trump, the US under Donald Trump, is going to pull out of the WHO. In the past, he's also threatened that the US is going to pull out of the WTO. So clearly, the US is becoming more insular. So if a vacuum is created, can China position itself and can China take the position or fill in the vacuum which will be left by the United States? The fact remains that hitherto, before the 21st century, China was not the most important pole of international relations. China's ascendance in international relations is primarily because of its emergence as an economic juggernaut. Deng Xiaoping's reforms and opening up of 1978, they helped China in emerging as the manufacturing platform of the world, which in turn added to the military and diplomatic clout that China has in international relations. The question which emerges today in this COVID-19 world order as countries try to, find ways and mechanisms to move away from China, because they're facing a supply chain breakdown from China, and they're trying to increasingly propel their own domestic industries to restart production, to provide a fillip to their tumble down growth rates. The question which emerges today is, can China re-emerge as the global leader of supplies in the international system? Can made in China uh, propel China, or can it push China again into a formidable position in international relations? If China succeeds, will it be able to recreate the strength and the power it created for itself in the 1990s and in the 2000s? To answer that, it first becomes very important to look at the current status that the Chinese economy is in, the steps that China has taken to move beyond the pandemic and to restart production. Only after this can we make an assessment of the direction Chinese diplomacy will take in the near future. So, in the first wave of the pandemic, which began in Wuhan, China officially China officially reported 83,364 total cases with 4,634 deaths. These are the official numbers from Wuhan. Dr. Li Wenliang, he was silenced when he first sounded the warning bells about the emergence of a new strain of virus, which was very similar to the severe acute respiratory syndrome, the SARS of 2002. When Dr. Li Wenliang, he sounded the warning bells in November last year, he was rebuked by the Wuhan police. He was taken for interrogation, and he was rebuked for spreading misinformation amongst the public. So that has not been taken very well by the Chinese public, the kind of treatment that was meted out to Dr. Li Wenliang. Dr. Li, sadly enough, he succumbed to COVID-19 this year in February, and his death in February this year caused further furor amongst the Chinese public. In June this year, Hu Weifang, who was a neurologist at the Wuhan Central Hospital, the same central hospital as Dr. Li Wenliang's, he died of the virus after suffering a 4-month-long battle. Hu was the 6th doctor from the hospital killed by the virus. In June, after Hu Weifang's death, there was a hashtag on Chinese social media with more than 400 million views and more than 46,000 comments. Questions were raised about why the heads of the hospital, they had not been punished, including Tsai Li, who is the head of the Communist Party at the hospital. There have been a flood of photos, videos, and witness accounts from hospitals in Wuhan. Now, this is an impact which happened on the public health system of Wuhan. If we look at the overall growth indices, China's economic growth rate, as Professor Upadhyay also pointed out, it dropped by 6.8% year on year in the first quarter of 2020. Growth rate was at a negative of -3%. Investment showed a -10% growth year on year. And there are 600 million Chinese people who are not well off. Urban unemployment, and this is a figure from April. Urban unemployment was at 6%, and there still is an immense difficulty in absorbing migrant laborers in this extremely new and varied job market. As China restarts opening up, as Chinese factories get back to work, there is a need for migrant laborers. But then there's also the fear that they might be carriers of the COVID-19 again. So a very strange kind of job market has emerged. So this is another problem which is emerging. In addition to this, in the intellectual sphere, in the academic sphere, intellectuals and professors such as Su Chongrun, Su Chiyong, Chang Sui-chong, and Yu Linqi, they have demanded on WeChat that Xi Jinping steps down. On March 22 this year, on Weibo, the princelings, or the children of the high-level veteran CCP, Chinese Communist Party cadres, they called for an emergency enlarged meeting of the CCP's Politburo to discuss Xi Jinping's replacement. On March 23rd, Ran Zhiqiang, who is a Chinese reality tycoon, he wrote an opinion piece called, and in that opinion piece, he called Xi Jinping a clown. He said that this clown insists on wearing the emperor's new clothes. So Ran Zhiqiang, he's former chief of the Beijing Huayuan Group, which is a state-owned company. He's a state-owned developer, and he's known to be a pretty outspoken maverick. So people, or even people in power actually, or people, highly visible people, including academics, including intellectuals, they have been risking getting imprisoned or getting penalized because they just want to show that there's a big disgruntlement within China with the way that COVID-19 has been handled, the kind of impact that has happened on the public health sector, with the kind of impact that has happened on the economy so far. However, fact remains that a week ago, China's economy has reportedly returned to modest growth in the second quarter of 2020. It has reverted from the first contraction on record, and it reportedly right now it stands at 3.2%. Chinese growth rate officially stands at 3.2% for this particular quarter. So China slowly started easing its lockdown much before the rest of the world, and Chinese factories have started reopening in April this year. Even before April, as gathered from personal interviews with foreign workers working in Beijing, offices started reopening in February itself, and employees were asked to report physically to work just twice in a week, while for the remaining 6 days, work from home was permitted. By April, in Beijing, things started getting more relaxed. People were allowed to move more freely in public spaces, but with the highest precautions. As soon as anyone enters a public space, temperature checks are conducted. Hands are sprayed with medical grade 75% and above alcohol spray. And service staff, they wear masks at all times. No home visits are allowed by friends, as apartments give residents this community card, which they have to show anytime that they leave or enter a compound. Elevators are disinfected every day. In restaurants and bars, which form an important segment of the service sector in China, not more than 4 people are allowed at a table. Authorities also make sure that people scan these QR codes to check if people have been in Beijing for over 14 days or if they have completed their quarantine. A lot of new industries are also coming up. And examples of these new industries manufacturing this long list of things ranging from hand sanitizers to isolation gowns, all of this have sprung up in a big way. In gymnasiums, even though the fear, at least sitting in India, remains that, there's not going to be a return anytime soon to any sports activities or swimming pools definitely. But in China, if you see in gymnasiums, there are these marking blocks at a decent enough gap for group activities like, say, Zumba or, say, Tai Chi Chuan. So, things are slowly getting back to normal. That helps China, that helps Chinese economy get back to normal. Domestic flights are fully functional. And in terms of managing migrant labor and creating new jobs, China has undertaken a lot of innovative steps. At this point, let's move away from Beijing and let's go and look at Wuhan in January this year. On January 23rd this year, China's central government imposed a lockdown in Wuhan, which was the epicenter of the coronavirus. And the lockdown was announced at 10 p.m. Local time, which is 2 a.m. GMT. And normally busy train stations and airports were left empty immediately after that. So Wuhan is a city of about 11 million people. It saw the cancellation of all trains and planes in and out. Residents at that time in January, most of them were preparing for the Lunar New Year. And they were warned not to move in or out. Lunar Festival, as some of you might know, is a huge festival in China, is a big festival in other Asian countries as well, wherein there's a significant Chinese population. And there's a lot of travel which happens because all Chinese people want to go back to their families because it's the cultural practices around it are very family oriented. So every resident was warned to not travel in or out, even though they were clearly preparing for the lunar festival. Now, the advantage, some migrant laborers at this particular point of time, they had an advantage. And why do I say they had an advantage? They had an advantage because they had already moved out of Wuhan, right? They had moved out of Wuhan and left for their respective hometowns for the Lunar New Year celebrations. Migrant workers often begin their travels for the Lunar New Year much before white-collar laborers start their movement back home, or the affluent classes can start planning for any sort of travel. Migrant workers plan and start their movement much before the affluent classes, for the simple reason that faster means of transport like flights and bullet trains are out of reach of these migrant workers. which is why they start their long, arduous journeys. Say from even the most affluent coastal provinces of Guangdong, they might really have to go back to Xinjiang, which is a huge distance. So they start their long, arduous journey much before, and because they have to use slower methods of transport, which entails that they have to leave much before their white collar counterparts. So these people, a significant section of Wuhan's residents, they had started moving already. This was advantageous to a certain extent because then Wuhan did not have the kind of migrant crisis that we sitting in India we saw. China was in a way, the silver lining in China's SARS cloud of 2002 was that it prepared China for a future pandemic like COVID-19. In the immediate aftermath of SARS outbreak in 2002, it was much more worse. Millions of migrant laborers faced the risk of the virus spread. And the government at that time and the public, they considered rural urban migrant workers as the most problematic group during the SARS outbreak in China in early 2003. They feared that migrant workers who were susceptible to this virus, as they tended to flee major cities where the early outbreaks occurred, it was assumed that they would, spread the virus to other sections of the society. But this time around, that did not happen. So, China's SARS experience helped China to deal with China's COVID-19 experience. Why do I talk about migrant laborers? Why this emphasis on migrant laborers? Because China's economic rise has been built on the availability of cheap labor from migrants in particular. According to the China Labor Bulletin of Hong Kong, there were an estimated 288 million rural migrant workers in China in 2018, making up more than 1/3 of the entire working population. While migrant workers have been the engine of China's spectacular economic growth over the last 3 decades, they face several structural and societal constraints like other parts of the developing world or of the global south. So, which is why this emphasis on migrant laborers, and the emphasis is also required because to restart the Chinese economy, to restart production in Chinese factories, migrant laborers would be required. At this point in time, these migrant laborers have moved out of Wuhan in January. As Wuhan struggled out of the lockdown by April this year, the Chinese government, in tandem with local governments, tried to get these migrant laborers back from the countryside, back into the cities, because they got rendered jobless. That adds to China's unemployment data. That also adds to the fact that there will be more disgruntlement with the CCP, with Xi Jinping's leadership, and with governance in general. Which is why it became very pertinent that these laborers be brought back to, say, factory X, Y, Z in Wuhan, where they were working. Also, to jumpstart production again, you need the laborers. So for this, the local government did not just take these laborers from, say, Xinjiang or Kansu or Tibet, and just leave them into Wuhan. What they did is that they organized collective transport for them from their villages for the specified factories. This curtailed free movement of labor and reduced the possibilities of the virus spread. This entire process is called point-to-point transport. What happens in this process is that there's a labor dispatching company or an entity which is created, which is also leading to some sort of an alternative form of employment. This entity collates the number of laborers in, say, village X, right? And these number of laborers in village X have to be transported to factory Y. When laborers are gathered and they have to board the transport from village X, there's a full monitoring of health conditions of laborers, which is undertaken by the local government and authorities of village X. Similarly, when these laborers are deboarding at factory Y, the local government monitors the health of each laborer. The entire point-to-point transport is done through a closed designated route and is monitored so that people randomly cannot board the transport and increase the possibilities of the virus spread. As much as surveillance that is entailed in this, it was done and it is done so that at least people can get back to their jobs and people have livelihoods again. Another scheme which is intended for labor security, it entails the creation of another sort of intermediary company, which again increases the scope for alternative employment creation. In this process, for example, if laborer A is employed in a restaurant and has been temporarily laid off because restaurants cannot function fully under conditions of quarantine, then she can be employed temporarily by, say, a delivery company till such time as the situation does not go back to normal. So this person is still getting another form of employment. And this intermediary company, which is created, in this company also alternative forms of employment are being generated. As far as meeting people's food, medical, and clothing needs were concerned, e-commerce played a very big role, more so in China. But initially this got impacted by the lockdown, just the way it was impacted even in India. And in order to assuage the situation, as e-commerce and deliveries were allowed slowly again, what China has done, the Chinese government came up with a set of orders. The delivery personnel's body temperature shows up on the receiving customer's phone screen, who can deny receiving the package if the delivery personnel is suffering from a high temperature. So China has been taking a lot of steps to ensure that its economy can get back to normal at the earliest. Now coming to companies, most companies sadly are experiencing a serious economic fallout, including lower than expected demand and forced reduction of their workforce. This is true even for companies which were entirely focused on the Chinese local market and were not exporting to prime export destinations of EU and US. These disruptions have happened, but the point to note is that disruptions are not uniform across China's businesses. While some companies are in distress, others report doing better as a consequence of the COVID-19. Different companies, depending on the industry size, are in short living in different worlds. In general, technology, tech-oriented companies, online companies have recovered much faster at twice the rate of non-tech companies to their pre-pandemic expectations. By contrast, 1/3 of non-tech companies have seen their demand drop by more than half. Perhaps and not surprisingly, tech and online companies are twice as more optimistic about the future. In Chengdu, for example, more people are allowed to start businesses on the lines of street employment, small scale employment. And this is where I would want to take you to something which I witnessed in China, something which I've sadly enough seen even in Sarojini Nagar market in New Delhi. But I've seen this happening at a much larger scale in China. There is this entity called Changguan, or urban management or urban police, which is in charge of ensuring that traffic is at bay and these small shops do not come up and they do not restrict traffic or movement, etc. But the fact is, in today's world, in this COVID-19 world order, the government has given orders in Chengdu, which is in one of the central provinces, slightly towards the south. And the provincial government has given orders that more and more people should start these street businesses, something which was earlier broken down by this entity called Changguan. Let me show you, let me try and show this video to you if I could, which will help make it easier to understand. 1 second. Let me try and share the screen. 1 second. Okay, the audio does not matter really because most of it is in Chinese, and it's the video is more important. Okay, I shall stop sharing screen. So, even though these Changwons are pretty low and they're pretty hated, the fact is that their powers are a bit getting curtailed. So, in a way, that is good news even for the Chinese society. Why is it being done now? Because street vendors are being encouraged now, or small businesses are being encouraged in a big way to jumpstart the Chinese economy. As was shown in the video, these Changwons are separate from the conventional police forces, and they are responsible for managing more quotidian aspects of urban life, regulating street vendors, unlicensed construction sites. But their powers are getting curtailed, at least temporarily, so that even the smallest business, if it can come back, it will create some sort of an employment. It will generate some sort of growth. What has also been announced is in China is that Hainan, or the Southern Island province, will be the next export hub. Details are still awaited, but if China has made the announcement, then clearly it is aiming at creating Made in China 2.0 and unleashing its manufacturing prowess all over again. Um, uh, you know, in Feb.
Hello.
Hello. Yes.
Turn on your camera. Yes, Professor Sriparna. Turn on your camera. We cannot see you.
Okay. Can you see me now?
We can see you. Yes. Yeah.
Okay. You can see me. Okay. Okay. So the many beauties of operating in a COVID-19 world order, we have to rely more on technology. In February itself, Professor Upadhyay already talked in much detail about banking policies. Something which China is doing to actually create some sort of safety for its own public is that the Chinese central government in February this year announced that all Chinese banks now literally have to launder or wash and iron their cash, disinfecting it with ultraviolet light and high temperatures, and have to store it for 7 to 14 days before releasing it to the customers. This might sound like a trivial detail, but the fact remains that China is actively trying to dissuade its own public from using cash, and they're also shifting to apps or to more digital form of payment, which was already existing in China, but it's becoming much more stronger now. And that also is an impact. That is also a shift with the Chinese economy is undergoing at the moment. Fact remains that China is opening up. It has even opened up Disneyland in Shanghai, and people are going there with masks, hand sanitizers, and maintaining social distance. So, this opening up indicates that the Chinese economy will be back in shape much before the others do. Since China is opening its economy while the other countries are still in lockdown, manufacturing may further move to China and the world may become even more dependent on it. However, there's a lot of distrust which has been created by the pandemic. And this means that countries are actively seeking to move their supply chains away from China. An example of this is Japan. In an initiative taken to secure local supply chains and to reduce dependency on China, the Japanese government has decided to pay its companies for moving factories out of China and back home. Japan reportedly is willing to pay 57 companies a total sum of 536 million US dollars to bring their manufacturing back to China. Another example is that of South Korea. The rising trade war between China and the US had already led South Korea to mull its options, and given the economic slump that has come in the wake of the current pandemic, Hyundai and several other big Korean companies have indicated their desire to shift out of China. In addition to this, another problem which is emerging is that China is utilizing medical aid or medical sales as a political tool. An example of this is from Netherlands, when Netherlands this year, in order to show its gratitude to Taiwan's health workers, it revised its embassy's name to Netherlands office Taipei. It flew in tulips and stroopwafels to thank those health workers in Taiwan. China cut off supply of medical equipment and face masks to the Netherlands. So this causes a lot of distrust in China at the international level. India has banned 59 Chinese apps, and in the face of heightened aggression from China, other countries like Australia and the US are also mulling similar options. China's BRI projects have also taken a severe hit as Chinese workers have had to return home, and recipient countries of these BRI projects they are now more skeptical of the economic costs to restart the Belt and Road Initiative, the BRI projects. China definitely is in an advantageous position to leverage its coming out of the pandemic induced lockdown sooner. But the distrust that it has created in international relations by its information cover ups, by its military aggression, and attempts to use aid as a political tool just mean that dark clouds over China's future as a potential leader of the international system continue hovering. This is in addition to the fact that a second wave of COVID-19 in Beijing might slow down the economy again. Um, in any case, China's economy or China's economic growth or uh, China's appearance as an economic juggernaut depends on an export-reliant growth model. About 38% of its GDP is reliant on international trade. Friendly international relations is needed for trade, and this has been outlined several times in the past by several Chinese leaders as well. China's aggression as seen against Vietnam, the US, EU, Taiwan, India, to name just a few, will be a major hurdle in smooth trade ties facilitating China's economic rise 2.0, and there will be severe repercussions on China's desires to be a leader in international relations because of this military aggression. Their economic rise, all the economic steps that they have been taking so far to overcome this pandemic are very laudable, and a few developing countries could also take few examples out of these. But the military aggression is only going to mean that whatever positives had been created by China so far, that's not going to reap it much of a benefit. With that, I come to the end of my this presentation, and thank you so much for your patience.
Yeah, thank you so much, Professor Sriparna, for your informative presentation, and you have just like take us to a journey to China, and we have seen what has happened before and during the pandemic, and how the Chinese economy is rebooting itself after the pandemic. So thank you so much for your insightful presentation, and now we are moving to the third and last part of our presentation section with Professor Rityusha Mani Tiwari. I'm sorry. Professor Rityusha is a visiting fellow at the Institute of Chinese Studies in New Delhi. She teaches as well in the Department of Political Science in Shahid Bhagat Singh College in University of Delhi. She holds a PhD in Chinese Studies from Jawaharlal Nehru University in New Delhi. She is the assistant editor of China Report, a journal of East Asian Studies since 2016. She was the recipient of the visiting program for young sinologists in 2017, awarded by the Ministry of Culture, People's Republic of China, and the Chinese Academy of Social Sciences in Beijing. She is interested in the questions of leadership and power in South Asia and East Asia, with an emphasis on strategic thought in China and India. She has also other research interests, including studying gender, peace, and conflict. Today, Professor Rityusha will share with us her expert opinion on the COVID-19 pandemic and opportunities of regional response in South Asia. So I welcome Professor Rityusha and ask her please to start her talk. Professor Rityusha.
Thank you, Dr. Hibatullah. Thank you for introducing me and also having me over. It's really a great honor to come to your to virtually come to your space and take part in this dialogue. So thank you so much. I'm going to focus on COVID-19 pandemic and opportunities of regional response in South Asia. When I say opportunities, I know that perhaps on the look of it, the opportunities are less than the challenges. But then in terms of the way we envision things for a region, perhaps it's the right time to start envisioning a greater response to this pandemic rather than limiting it to the national confines, to the territorial confines, and start, because the pandemic is not really a national pandemic, it's an international pandemic. So envisioning a response internationally or regionally or multilaterally, as it were, is perhaps more the need of the hour. Having said that, I'm going to sort of divide my presentation in 4 parts. I'm going to look at the assessment of COVID in South Asia, where I try to briefly trace and give a synoptic view of the response that different South Asian countries have had for the pandemic so far, and also focusing on the indicators that are available in terms of how well they are doing in those responses. I'm going to look at, in the next part of my presentation, I'm going to look at the way these countries have faced certain challenges, and whether these challenges are the ones which are multilateral in nature, which are vis-a-vis the relations that they have with other South Asian countries, or is it something which is significantly actually arising out of their own domestic turmoil or their own domestic situation. In the next part of my presentation, I'm going to, if at all I can, I'm going to sort of lay out a blueprint for very, very broad recommendations that could actually be thought of in terms of a regional response from South Asia for this pandemic. So I have certain tables which I'm not really going to share screen or something because I'm operating on 2 different systems, but I'm going to just look at certain key data from those tables and cull out my observations regarding that data. So kindly bear with me if the data part is something which is not very, very clear here, but I'll try to minimize my data in that sense. So COVID-19 cases have continued to rise rapidly in South Asia. And the health systems in most of the South Asian countries are actually struggling to treat hundreds and thousands of the patients that are there for the in this pandemic. Yet most of the countries are firmly on the path of reopening their economies. And in such a case, South Asia becomes a hub of coronavirus pandemic in terms of a public health crisis. An economic crisis, and also a humanitarian crisis. My 2 other co-panelists have actually looked at 2 different aspects of the kind of response or realignment of, powers that has been there in the level of world politics vis-a-vis the pandemic. One was really a broader look. The second was basically a response from a particular country, China. And now I'm trying to make it a multilateral response in that sense. So if you come back to this region, you know that the unfolding of pandemic brought forth all the weaknesses that have always existed in some form or the other in South Asian countries. And actually, there have been long calls to basically start cooperating across these national boundaries in South Asia to address at least some of these long-standing, long-running maladies that exist. So the humanitarian crisis that we saw was perhaps worst manifest in terms of the way migrant laborers, for instance, had the impact of this pandemic on themselves, and the way the migrant laborers had to focus on returning to at least the bare minimum possible means of livelihood that they might have had from the beginning, from the origin of their from where they originated. So looking at this entire population also means looking at nearly a quarter of the world population, which is in this part of the world, which is densely settled region, and its residents' access to quality infrastructure and healthcare is basically varied in terms of the access and also in terms of the actual availability of those resources. Now, despite the increasing penetration of, for instance, mobile phone networks, most of the South Asians have still very limited awareness of public health issues related with COVID-19, which is the focus of these times. So even if you have a good network access, the awareness regarding public health schemes, the public health standard procedures are not really that are reaching all the South Asians in most of these countries. So countries in this region have extraordinarily large informal economies. Now that's a second aspect of how these South Asian economies are connected. The bulk of their working population have no employment contract or benefits. So it's informal economies at max. differing levels of development within countries basically drive large-scale internal circulation of workers, which is where the entire idea of migrant laborers comes from. Now, differing levels of development across all of these countries also means that South Asia is plugged into global labor force, not really just via migrant workers in different parts of the world to Middle East or elsewhere, whose financial repatriation is crucial for their families back home, but also the South Asian countries have limits in their ability to mitigate the effects of these multiple crises. Now, the pandemic is likely to exacerbate existing political and security challenges that are already there. And if one just, mentions a few, the civil war in Afghanistan, the civil military imbalance or seesaw that we see in Pakistan, to the Rohingya crisis in Bangladesh's southern border from the neighboring country. We have a multiple set of existing security and political challenges in this region. So I try to map out a very synoptic view of the impact on South Asia, where I take the stock of these countries, how they are dealing with this complex health emergency, how prepared they are in terms of health infrastructure and also income levels, whether the countries in South Asia are able to deal with the pandemic in terms of the government's response so far as public health measures are concerned, and what are some of the challenges which are there in South Asia as a region, so that a regional response can be envisioned. Now, in the first instance, we must start looking at two measures of health infrastructure, and this is a table which is available with World Health Organization, and some of the key pointers out of that are actually the number of physicians and hospital beds, whether physicians per 1,000 persons. What is the what exactly is the level of physicians per 1,000 beds across South Asian countries? And we know that the most interesting or the most significant data out of this is that the number of physicians per 1,000 persons is actually the lowest in Bangladesh at 0.5. It is followed by India at 0.8 physicians per 1,000 persons. Now, Pakistan and Sri Lanka have a higher figure where one physician per 1,000 person is available, and hospital beds per 1,000 person is lowest in Pakistan at 0.06, followed by India at 0.07, and then Bangladesh at 0.08. Now, with 3.6 hospital beds per 1,000 persons, Sri Lanka is actually 5 times the number of other 3 countries. So Sri Lanka, it's not really a very difficult thing to guess then how Sri Lanka has been able to respond to this crisis in terms of health infrastructure in a much better and a sustained manner over its other South Asian counterparts. Now, if we next look at the other 2 measures of health expenditure, which is the share of GDP, and in per capita terms, we know that current health expenditure as a share of GDP is very close amongst the countries in South Asia. Bangladesh, for instance, has the lowest at 2.3%. Sri Lanka, on the other hand, has the highest at 3.8. So there's not much of a gap. It's 2.3 to 3.8, and all the South Asian countries are actually in that dense, figure in terms of what percentage of their GDP they invest in health infrastructure. But these countries are actually also very different in terms of population and GDP. So one must not sort of take it in that, simplistic terms. Hence, therefore, a better way to compare health infrastructure and expenditure is to perhaps look at the per capita figure. Now, I'm going to skip the per capita because most of the people familiar with South Asia have a fairly good idea of the per capita incomes that are there in these South Asian countries. And I'm going to move on straight forward to government response to COVID-19 in these countries, where in South Asia, the governments have responded with 2 sets of policies primarily. The first is related to measuring the physical distance in society, the measures that they have taken for physical distancing, which basically are aimed at reducing the speed of transmission of the virus. And the second is increased testing to detect and isolate infected patients. The second set of policies, other than these two, is basically related to expenditure that is necessary to deal with the health and economic impact of the pandemic. A very detailed study of this is available with the Johns Hopkins University coronavirus dashboard. So if someone is interested, they can go to Johns Hopkins University coronavirus dashboard, as also the International Monetary Fund COVID-19 country level policy tracker. So these are the two good sources to sort of have this kind of a data at hand, where you basically have summaries regarding the basic information about government responses. And I have tried to cull out the South Asian countries from there and discuss some of the components here. So in terms of these, the parameters that actually can be looked at is basically when was the first case reported across the South Asian countries, when was the second set of cases were reported, which is 50 or more, when were the schools, colleges, etc. were closed, when did the national lockdown start, and then what was the total level of testing per 1,000 persons, say in the first week of May, first week of June, first week of July, and so on and so forth. Also, overall COVID-19 health expenditure as a percentage of GDP. And that's a very interesting thing, because Bangladesh had COVID-19 health expenditure as a percent of GDP at 0.01. India had at 0.1. Pakistan had it at 0.07. Sri Lanka had it at par with India, which is 0.1. So also, the last set of figures that actually can be looked at from that entire set of data is COVID-19 economic stimulus that all of these countries sort of announced as stimulus packages as a part of as a percentage of their GDP. And again, here, if you look at what has been the data for different countries, and if I just look at Bangladesh, it's 0.34%. For India, it's 0.8%. For Pakistan, it's actually 3.34%. And for Sri Lanka, it's 0.1%. So we know that there's been a very different set of data which is available across South Asian countries in terms of how they have been able to respond to the crisis so far. Now, I'm going to move on to a brief outlay of the COVID impact in South Asia, picking out instances and certain key informations from different countries. And I'm going to begin with India in that sense, being the largest country in South Asia. India has third highest COVID-19 caseload in the world, where it overtook actually Russia on July 6, 2020. And in early June, we know that the government had lifted its lockdown after 2 months of restriction. Since then, India has seen a huge spike in the number of coronaviruses. And India has, by all estimates, we know that it's still not the peak that India has touched. By comparison, the United States is dealing with the kind of peak that they were supposed to experience. So we know that we have not touched that level of peak or a spike in terms of the number of persons infected by coronavirus so far. The Indian lockdown has also revealed unfolding picture of humanitarian crisis. As I've mentioned earlier, millions of migrants across the country struggle to get home, and Goldman Sachs also predicted a massive 45% second quarter contraction in the country's economy. Moody's downgraded India's sovereign rating to lowest investment grade level. IMF predicted something like minus 1.8% of growth rate for the GDP. And also that many experts believe that the economic situation to recover slowly might happen when unemployment already has peaked at 24% in May. So it is expected that with slow reopening that this unemployment peak might come down. And since we see the decreasing of unemployment rate as restrictions ease, Indian states are actually mounting or gearing up towards a separate, variegated, uncoordinated policy to combat the cases of COVID-19 as the situation demands in different states. For instance, in Tamil Nadu, the southern state, which has the second highest number of cases, authorities are reinstating a stricter lockdown in different phases. On the other hand, Delhi, which has very high number of cases again remains opened. Maharashtra, worst affected case of the states, basically sees very encouraging response in Dharavi, which is Asia's largest slum, where a very surprisingly a very successful model emerged. We could see the implementation of social distancing, which is basically considered impossible in densely populated areas, and where 80 residents were basically sharing one toilet, but that kind of social distancing was possible in Dharavi, and the aggressive testing and screening measures paid off, and as a result the daily infection in Dharavi was reduced to its third basically since early May. So there are certain differences in the kind of regional locations that are there of different states, and therefore the policy has not really been a centralized policy in India. Now, coming to Pakistan in South Asia, cases have grown, but large lockdowns are actually over. Pakistan's caseload has also almost doubled since the beginning of the June. And the conclusion of the nationwide lockdown and violation of Pakistan's standard operating procedures, which was basically intended to prevent transmission of the coronavirus during the Eid holidays, has actually driven the increase in cases. The WHO has ranked Pakistan amongst the 10 countries in the world with the fastest growing numbers of new COVID-19 cases. So we're not really doing well. I mean, in top 10, we already have 2 South Asian countries in that sense. And also WHO criticized the hasty removal of restrictions in Pakistan, though the growth of cases has also been attributed to increasing testing. Pakistan's overall testing rate remains low, indicated by a 22% positivity rate, which is basically far greater than WHO's own recommendations of 5% for reopening. So reopening happened in a rather haste manner. That's the main sort of point there. In response to government's testing, tracing, quarantining strategy, the more emphasis that is perhaps needed, or what the experts are pointing out, is towards reinstating an economically disruptive lockdown. So it might not be immediately beneficial to the economy, but it is expected that even if it's economically not viable, the lockdown needs to be reinstated, because the number of cases are simply going out of hand. The central government is imposing restrictions on movement in hotspot areas in 20 major cities in Pakistan. And like the rest of South Asia, the country is basically forced to make a difficult trade-off between either containing the virus or letting the citizens somehow struggle without incomes. So as cases rise, hospitals are operating beyond capacity and doctors are overworked, which is basically a common picture across South Asian countries. And adding to the list of many public figures who have actually tested positive, there are ministers, there are former prime ministers, and so on and so forth in Pakistan who've also come in who've become COVID infected patients. So moving on to the third country in South Asia, one of the newspapers, the Daily Star, on June 16 actually declared Bangladesh as a place where confusion reigns supreme, and there was a nationwide lockdown at the end of May, but that was lifted in June, and Bangladesh is now basically it awaits the information about the timing and geographical extent of a new area by area lockdown system. We know that it's again moved into that kind of a phase-wise lockdown. It's not a countrywide lockdown anymore. And in hard-hit red zones, which includes much of Dhaka and Chittagong, people are not allowed to enter or exit these zones, leaving their house or go to work. So it's a complete lockdown in that sense. However, the nationwide rollout of the system, which could have ultimately led to basically place a quarter of country's areas into red zones, has been delayed by because the lack of data, because for the simple lack of data, there was no data on where these cases are actually located, and the tracing of the cases was not that easy till June in Bangladesh, and that kind of a sense continues even today, because new data is emerging in newer areas of Bangladesh almost every day. So a new daily high for country has been reached in the beginning of July with both the number of cases as well as the number of deaths. And like Pakistan, Bangladesh has also had a persistingly high test positivity rate of around 20%. So for Pakistan, it was 22 and it's 20% for Bangladesh. To quote a senior health official, who gave an interview in the Dhaka Tribune, it's basically very hard to assume when the peak day will be coming for Bangladesh. And a report by Transparency International Bangladesh basically uncovered many deficiencies in country's COVID-19 response in that sense. For instance, only one lab in the entire country is authorized to test for the virus as late as March 25. And over the past 2 months, the daily testing rate has also improved. But basically, it's just half a dozen laboratories which are basically doing this kind of a testing. So it's basically a lot of shortage in that sense in terms of health infrastructure availability. Moving on to Afghanistan, the healthcare system has floundered massively because the number of coronavirus cases in Afghanistan also exceeds the kind of numbers that were there in March, and now the spike. Afghanistan is also moving towards a spike, and COVID-19 has added more pressure to country's public health care system, which was actually already overwhelmed by victims of conflict and malnourishment. Afghanistan is actually the poorest country in South Asia, where the GDP per capita is around half of Nepal and 1/3 of its neighbor Pakistan. Meanwhile, we know that the Taliban has been ramping up attacks, targeting an already vulnerable healthcare system and putting the health of millions at risk. So acknowledging that public hospitals are operating beyond capacity, the government authorized private hospitals to start performing COVID-19 tests sometime in mid of June. A move that was criticized by many Kabul residents, as that came with a hefty price tag of around $100 per person per test, making it almost unaffordable for most of the Afghans. And additionally, the ability of the private hospital to conduct the test has also been questioned, the authenticity of the test result. So citizens have also claimed that certain hospitals in Kabul are running out of oxygen. When there's also this entire dubiousness to natural remedies that has been put forth as alternate healthcare system, and Afghanistan struggles to cope. Meanwhile, EU sends an aircraft with life-saving equipments, which pledged an aid package of nearly $44 million to the country, but the health organization Doctors Without Borders had to withdraw from a hospital in Kabul following a tragic attack in June, which killed basically 24 people and wounded many. Now, moving on to Nepal. Nepal saw its largest single daily total of COVID-19 cases in the last part of June, bringing the total past 10,000. The number of deaths is relatively low in Nepal at just at just the double figures. Now, under Nepal's lockdown, which was imposed in late March, 3 of every 5 workers lost their job. So the story is very different in terms of how the economy coped with COVID-19. The tourism, tourism was absolutely crushed, which is singularly important to the Nepalese economy, and it dropped by 60%. The government partially eased the lockdown in early June, but Nepal saw an ongoing peaceful protest against the government's handling of the crisis. The protesters' demands were basically on financial accountability and greater testing capacity. And in response to these protests, the government announced that it would allow private hospitals to conduct COVID-19 tests. Now, moving on to Sri Lanka, where one of the best pictures from South Asia is present in terms of its response to COVID-19. We know that the number of active cases in Sri Lanka peaked in June, and since then we see a gradual declining, moving towards often single digits of daily new cases. And again, the number of cases is very low there, something similar to Nepal, and a fertility rate is actually just 0.6%. Over 3/4 of all the cases are either sailors or people who arrived from overseas. Sri Lanka also has relatively strong healthcare system already in place, which basically was able to successfully stave off a widespread outbreak by making testing widely available and investing very early in the disease surveillance system from February end and March beginning itself. So Sri Lanka has been able to relax its restrictions and maintained a nightly curfew for months. However, Sri Lankan economy is also in trouble. The main part of the trouble is the debt, which has been accumulating for years and now is facing low growth and declining revenues, where the country is facing low growth and declining revenues, and Sri Lanka may be forced to accept yet another financial aid package from IMF just to be able to keep to the bare minimum in terms of the national debts that are accumulating. But these stimulus packages from IMF, if they come at all, they'll come with even more stringent conditions. So nonetheless, we know that Sri Lanka's central bank has basically not opened its coffers to revive the economy yet, and that is something around which a lot of national debate is centered. Finally, I'll just touch upon Bhutan and Maldives, and I'll move on to the next part where I just try to pitch some of the challenges. So Maldives has basically started allowing tourism in phases, and it also has less number of cases, but then the population is also very less in Maldives in that sense. The demographic profile of coronavirus patients in Maldives is unique, and that point needs to be laid here. Around 60% of the confirmed cases of coronavirus patients are actually men between the ages of 21 and 40. And over half of these are Bangladeshi citizens, which are mostly migrant workers. So we know that where the impact of coronavirus was. If we just look at Bhutan, the last several months, we've seen Bhutan has also emerged as a model for how small developing countries can actually contain the virus. And Bhutan has had almost no fatality and just 67 confirmed cases by the beginning of the end of June. And national solidarity, public trust in officials, and even the public health background of the top political offices, including the Prime Minister, has in that sense helped. And like rest of the South Asia, however, Bhutan also struggles economically because while presenting the annual budget to the National Assembly, Finance Minister announced that domestic revenues have fallen by 14% in 2021 fiscal year and predicted very low revenue next year due to the decline in tourism and trade-related taxes. So the economic contingency plan that the government has started accepting grants and loans, including bilateral loans, to stimulate the economy while reducing its deficit. One component of this accepting loan through economic contingency plan is actually Build Bhutan, which is under the Labour Ministry program, which employs around 7,000 job seekers in construction sector. Most of these job seekers actually come from India. So moving on to the next set, which is challenges, and I'm just going to sort of pitch these challenges country-wise, not really pondering for too long on these. For instance, Afghanistan basically is fighting a pandemic in a war zone. So there is, on the one hand, pandemic, the other hand, the war zone that is already there. And it's a situation of immense conflict, both domestically in terms of the health insecurity of the people due to a disease, and also the health insecurity of the people because of the war, the ongoing war. For Bangladesh, the main challenge is the coronavirus has engulfed the entire territory and also its refugees. So the single largest challenge that was already present there was also the issue of refugees. And to top it all, you get coronavirus. So That's another kind of challenge that Bangladesh has in front of it. Bhutan presents, on the other hand, a successful coronavirus story in terms of providing health access to its citizens, but we know that economically it is also suffering. For India, it's probably the pandemic has opened up a can of worms, as it were, in terms of very ill-timed economic shock waves. So the worst casualty in terms of the pandemic for India has been its economy. Maldives, on the other hand, is basically looking at this pandemic as a new threat to an already at-risk archipelago. We know that Maldives has this environmental issue of sinking island, and the new threat in terms of the pandemic has emerged. Nepal has coronavirus as something which additionally strikes a recovering nation from in terms of economy. So again, its economy suffers the most. Pakistan basically presents a very contradicting picture in that sense. You see a more powerful economy, a more powerful army, more emboldened army, and a polarized public in terms of how the government has responded. So we know that the political stability question of Pakistan is something which is getting impacted a lot, other than, of course, pan-South Asian economic decline, as it were, due to the pandemic. So coming to Sri Lanka, it's been able to balance public health, at the same time have a centralized system of power. But we know that the biggest threat, perhaps, in the wake of this pandemic is how to handle the national debt and not invite additional debt with more stringent, more stricter terms and conditions. Now, in terms of the last part of my presentation, I'm just going to look at some broad outlines for recommendations. And I posit and I sort of submit that this is perhaps a good time for a regional cooperation program. In reality, the first virtual meeting of SAARC leaders in March was promising in that particular instance, looking at the background and the problems that had been already there, vis-a-vis when we look at SAARC working together as a viable, option of multilateral response to any issue, leave alone a pandemic. Sri Lanka, for instance, has given a very good picture of, public health system. And we know that one of the states in India, Kerala, has also provided a very successful picture of public health system and how to deal with the pandemic. So perhaps we know that Sri Lanka and Kerala can start, working in tandem to sort of create a larger regional response to the crisis, present a better model of public health system. Similarly, if you look at northern part of India, what has been happening in Nepal has a bearing to the northern part of India. If you look at the eastern part of India, Bangladesh matters a lot in that sense. And if you also look at the geographical variations that all of these South Asian countries have, some of them are mountainous areas, some of them are coastal areas. So the policies could be divided in terms of the variegated geography that these South Asian countries share amongst each other. So it's a good time to start working on this, making it a larger regional humanitarian project where everyone can sort of come across at least some commonality. I'm still placing a lot of onus on SAARC because so far as BIMSTEC is concerned, the ASEAN countries are already working out a program in collaboration with BIMSTEC. So that would take at least 2 BIMSTEC countries out of this South Asian response. So within SAARC, perhaps a greater possibility of this kind of a variegated approach and response to the crisis can be envisaged. The second point within the recommendation is the emergency fund that was actually established in March, and different countries basically announced the donations on their behalf to this emergency fund, where you know that India basically promised $10 million initially. Maldives, $200,000 million, $200,000. I beg your pardon. And Bhutan announced that it would contribute $100,000. Bangladesh, 1.5 million. Nepal and Afghanistan, 1 million each, and Sri Lanka, $5 million. Pakistan contributed $3 million. So it's being mulled over that SAARC countries could also loan this kind of a money to each other as and when the need arises, and also could start asking countries such as Japan or world organizations like World Bank, ADB, and even reach out to other multilateral organizations such as BRIC, ASEAN, for contribution and collaborations as a region, instead of taking it as a bilateral sort of loan. The third thing is perhaps, which a part of it has been mentioned by World Bank chief economist for South Asia, certain challenges which can be dealt with at a regional level. For instance, managing a migrant policy, envisaging a migrant worker policy together, not really territorially located within just one country, but looking at it in terms of how the region should respond, how, as I said, a variegated geography offers variegated approaches, and those perhaps should be employed. And also looking at where is the migrant worker flow from and to. Service sector revenue losses, food security for the poorest, and keeping the enterprises which are big and small going. These are some of the common areas of concern for all of these countries, and these are key priorities for the entire region. And therefore, entire region can envisage a kind of policy coming together, deliberating on all of these issues, having perhaps a standby industrial base for the region where companies could start to manufacture. So not really having a country-specific, industrial base, but also a pan-region industrial base with stakes from, different countries. Job creation, bilateral debts, as I already mentioned, modernizing agriculture in terms of food security, reactivating regional tourism. These are some of the focus areas on which these governments can get into. Other than that, of course, there's an entire set of, pandemic-related response, which is basically testing, which creates a big opportunity for employment while addressing the need for also medical equipment. So medical equipment, regionally produced, testing done by regional firms. The demand for hand sanitizer is rising. So that also needs to be looked at, how the region can look at the combined production of these necessary equipments. India is a big market, and so is Pakistan and Bangladesh in that regard. So whether, all of these necessary equipments can be regionally bought and sold, produced, and then perhaps regionally one can start thinking in terms of exporting these items. Another possibility that arises out of this entire pandemic is, of course, regional cooperation for economic partnership, which is already there between India and Sri Lanka, but hasn't come around. Economic and technology cooperation agreement, which is proposed between Sri Lanka and India, but hasn't really started. So these are some of the things which can provide already existing frameworks of cooperation, and within these areas can be focused upon. I'll put my presentation to rest here, and I'll probably look forward to the questions that are there in this regard. Thank you for bearing with me with so much of patience, and I'm really sorry if the data was something that was really confusing. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Professor Ityusha, for informative and detailed presentation on the impact of COVID-19 crisis in South Asian countries, and how they can overcome its related challenges, and what are the possible opportunities from that. So now we are done with the first part of our panel discussion for today, and as you have seen from the presentations delivered by our eminent guest speakers, that COVID-19 pandemic is now not only a global health crisis, but it is much more. It has unleashed a culture war in global politics, shaken the foundation of the healthy functioning of the global economy, and as you have seen, especially in the southern countries and in South Asia in particular. So now our panelists. So what we are going to do is that we are going to start our Q&A section for our session for today. So I have already requested our attendees to write their questions in the chat box, mentioning the name of the panelist and if they are inquiring, if they are asking a general question, so they are going to write for all panelists. So far we have first Dr. Jaskaran Singh. He has asked two questions, one for Professor Upadhyay. I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing wrong, and Professor Sriparna. So the first question is for Professor Upadhyay. So he's saying, what are the chances of emergence of deep state and conspiracy series of pandemic behind this COVID-19 pandemic? Professor Upadhyay, are you here? You would like to answer the question now?
The question is not
okay.
Deep state where?
Yeah, he is asking what are the chances of emergence of deep state and conspiracy theories of pandemic behind the current pandemic, the COVID-19?
The conspiracy theories are always there everywhere. I mean, we still don't know really, I mean, what happened and so on. And so much has been built around this thing that the blame game is going in so many directions and so on. There are accusations about WHO, about China, about different places and so on. So conspiracy theories, fake news is very important actually. I mean, so much news is fake news, wrong news. So this is already happening. And in the coming months, it may even increase more because the repercussions of the pandemic will be felt more and more in terms of economic loss. So there will be more blame game going around so many places. Is it clear? Hello?
I'm sorry. Yes, I was telling. Yes, that's clear, Professor. So we have another question from Dr. Jaskaran. It is for Professor Sriparna. He is asking, is authoritarian nature of the state is helping China to overcome this pandemic earlier as compared to other countries?
See, authoritarianism, of course, has its own limits, but during times like a pandemic, there is some necessity for some sort of control as well. In China, it's not just authoritarianism, I would say. The way that they've used data, the way that they've used whatever surveillance that was already existing, in the form of those face recognition systems or collecting of data. If you ever visit Beijing or Shanghai, one of these bigger cities, Beijing, I would say Beijing, since I've lived there for quite a long period of time, you would see a lot of cameras, and if you ask why these cameras are there, the answer is, which makes sense, is that these cameras are there so that no crimes take place, and every person has a huko, right? So it's easier to identify people, whoever is breaking the law. Now, since there's already an existing system in place, it becomes easier to use that during a pandemic. It becomes easier for them to already ensure that those QR codes are there and it becomes easier for the authorities to assign these QR codes to people. It becomes easier for apartments to ensure that, people adhere to the system of having this card, which they will show when they are getting in or getting out. A lot of these steps have actually been helpful, as compared to, say, what we are seeing in the United States right now. There's this huge resistance against wearing face masks, and people are saying that it's eroding our basic human rights, so we should not wear face masks, etc. So that becomes futile, and in situations of a pandemic, some bit of discipline is required. So maybe these institutions, these systems which were already prevailing in China did help them to quite an extent, and that is not possible to be replicated in, say, democratic countries like India or US, where the idea of human rights, where the freedom to question why people are being asked to wear masks or why people are being asked not to go out, that exists. So because of the system, because of the way people have been socialized, it has been a little advantageous for China. I hope that answers the question. I think there are like 4-5 more questions for me. Should I answer all at once, or should I should we go one by one?
Okay, if you would like, if you would like to answer the other questions that you are seeing are for you, I don't mind. Yes.
Okay. Okay, I'll just go in the order that I see them. I think Anidrisha had asked me a question about credit and China's supply of credit to other countries, and basically Chinese peripheral countries receiving such loans. To answer that, I would want to talk about how World Bank and IMF have called upon creditors to suspend loan repayments for the world's poorest countries. Right. So far, Chinese creditors have been silent on this. And last month, China Development Bank had stated that it would provide low-cost financing and loans for companies involved in the Belt and Road Initiative. But it's not very clear if this is meant solely for just Chinese companies. On April 15th, the G20 economies met, and they agreed that there'll be debt relief which will be given to the 76 poorest economies of the world. There'll be a suspension of official debt obligations till 2022. The next day, Chinese Finance Minister Liu Kun, he commented that China supports the suspension of debt repayment by least developed countries and will make necessary contributions to the consensus reached at G20. A Chinese Commerce Ministry official then stated in April that writing off onerous African debts to Beijing under the BRI in response to this COVID-19 is, quote unquote, not simple nor effective. This article actually appeared in the Global Times, and it appeared to be a response to the calls made by these G20 countries, for wealthy nations to suspend African debt repayments until the end of this year. Ministry of Commerce official Song Wei, who is officially identified as the deputy director of the Ministry of Commerce's Chinese Academy of International Trade and Economic Cooperation, he wrote that China should not write off African nations' debt, as international financial institutions have recommended, claiming such measures were not effective. So, there's not really like a clarity on this so far, but as far as assessment goes, China is not really willing to write off the debts that easily because it's not going to be very beneficial for them. Indication of how things could continue comes from this pronouncement, which was made from an economist at the People's Bank of China, Ma Jun. And he said that local governments are likely to respond by investing in high-cost infrastructure projects, right? So you will see more of investments coming from China. And, Chinese companies have started to up the ante to acquire or invest in distressed foreign assets in strategic locations. Why? Why is this happening? Even before this COVID-19, there was a lot of oversupply in the Chinese economy, which is why one of the reasons why the BRI had to be unleashed, so that investments can be made. This oversupply in cement, in steel, in iron ore, these can be utilized because they'll be invested in other countries. So the oversupply still remains. There is a huge, supply chains have broken down. Countries distrust China. So what happens to this oversupply? So if all of this could be channelized, if these could be put into other countries, then nothing like it. So China will try to, that is my assessment, China will try to invest more in strategic locations in the peripheral countries. And there are quite a few aid-hungry countries across the world. So this is going to continue. I think there was one question from Anantram Sundarbabu about, if there's any possibility that companies moving out of China could actually set up base in India. There was a lot of fanfare even when the US-China trade war was happening, and there were hopes that, a lot of American companies would move to India. And that fanfare has continued even in this COVID-19 world order. There has been a lot of movement from North American and European buyers in operating in China, and they've started to move to South and Southeast Asia, South Asia as well. And this started largely from the time that the US-China trade war began, and that does not seem to be ending anytime soon, even if Donald Trump loses the US presidential election in November. The two countries have locked horns too intricately, and untanglement doesn't seem that easy. Additionally, China is involved now in trade spats with Australia and with European countries. So, there has been a lot of sentiment in India that there's going to be this shift, and India will be able to attract much of the businesses due to its democratic polity and open market. Some 1,000 firms US firms were even approached by India with incentives for shifting their manufacturing plants to India. Some states like Uttar Pradesh have this special task force. There are major changes which are being announced in labor laws, and these have drawn some jibes from Chinese Communist Party's Global Times as well. But one sad bit is that most of these companies keep complaining about the bureaucratic and the red tapeism in India and the long delays in India. Japan has wanted to invest a lot of times in India. South Korean companies, including Hyundai, have wanted to move to India, but there's this constant complaint about red tapeism and bureaucracy. There's this study by this Japanese financial group called Nomura, and it states that the destination for most of the companies moving out from China remains in East and Southeast Asia. One more reason for this being that, say for a country like Vietnam, the pandemic has been handled much better than India has been able to handle the pandemic so far. So, companies would seek to move to such countries. Also, Vietnam has been very proactive, and recently, this Monday, it ratified a trade deal with the European Union. And this basically means that there's going to be removal of 85% tariff by the EU on exports of goods from Vietnam. So Southeast Asian countries are also taking a lot of proactive steps. If India can do some of these things, if we can emulate some of these steps, then maybe we will have a better shot. But till that does not happen, till we cannot unleash our own, we cannot leverage our own manufacturing prowess, things seem a little difficult. I think there were a couple of more questions. Again, I'll quickly look at the questions. I think Swati Lakshmi Bachu had asked me about where exactly is the line? Where does the CCP draw the line? When it comes to silencing people. If you look at Tiananmen Square massacre or event, whichever way you would want to see it, the term massacre is used by the Western world and by a lot of Indian academicians. Tiananmen Square event is used by the CCP and by the Chinese official state media. It happened when Gorbachev was visiting China, and he had to visit the Tiananmen Square, and there was the presence of international media, which is when things started going awry. It's not like on day one itself the CCP ordered tanks to come and crush dissent. It was in the backdrop. Whenever things start affecting China's credibility at the international stage, there will be more of an impetus, there will be more logic for the CCP to come cracking down. Till that does not happen, it will still be okay with it. In China, even though, we don't get a lot of news from China because knowledge of Chinese language is relatively low in India. The interest should be much higher in India. There should be much more Chinese studies. But, we don't get that much news. Also, China does not really put out the real news in its English media press. Protests do happen in China. People are discontented with unemployment. They are disgruntled with lack of jobs. They are disgruntled with inflation. So yeah, they do take part in this. They do take part in these low-level protests. But it's sad that it does not come out. They are crushed. There have been a lot of times when people have protested because of the better quality of air and water. They would want better qualities of air and water. So that does happen. But when it starts getting a little too big for the CCP's comfort, then they would draw the line, and that's when crushing of dissent would happen. Yashvi asks me, do you think that the Indian move to ban 59 Chinese apps is going to be counterproductive for India? how is it going to affect Indian industries? These 59 apps were banned because of security reasons. The assumption has been that this has been banned because this is a retribution for China's military aggression at Galwan. It's not just military retribution. If you look at news reports about, say, TikTok, for example, TikTok this year itself has been in the news much before this ban from India, because it was Apple caught it snooping into its software. There have been other complaints as well. There was a independent Israeli company which also talked about some of the bugs which is there in the TikTok apps, which can access the users' data. So there have been complaints about TikTok per se, which is why there's a security implication so there's a security implication about that. Beyond that, since I'm talking about TikTok, starting in 2017 onwards, there were these groups of young Chinese people who came to India on tourist visas, and they traveled to the most interior parts of India and the most impoverished villages, and they lived with a lot of families who are not as affluent as, say, we are, and they gifted them with Chinese smartphones with pre-installed TikTok apps, and they taught them how to make videos. The question emerges is, why does this have to be done? There is definitely an insecurity. There's definitely a questioning which will occur when such events happen. The other apps as well, they've all been they're all security threats, and data collection does happen. But if China decides to retaliate, that's also not going to be great for India, because as you've rightly pointed out, we do depend on China for a lot of things, including APIs, active pharmaceutical ingredients, which go into making of Indian medicines. If China decides to retaliate and we have not secured our own supplies for these APIs, then it's going to be difficult for India. How is it going to affect our own industries? Are our industries prepared for it? Well, at the moment, when the ban happened, I would still say that we needed to diversify our supply chain a lot. Maybe the government is working on it, and maybe they've not been vocal about it. But I can just hope that we are not too dependent on China, and a retaliation does not happen. I think there was another question for me, or I hope I've answered all of it. I think I've answered. There was one common. Okay, there's one more question. Okay, there are two more.
Yes. So we can move questions, and then
yeah,
okay.
Yeah, I will take again. I'll maybe in the second round I can take, but if we can move to someone else, I'll just quickly look at the questions in the meanwhile.
Okay, so we are having a hand that is raised, Dr. Firdaus Malik. You do have a question to ask? You may unmute.
Hello. Yes, am I audible?
Yes, you are.
Yeah, I have a question for Professor Upadhyay. So my question is, as COVID-19 challenges is there, I will talk about India and China. China to some extent has, recovered it very well, but in India, it is, spreading at a faster rate. So where is the problem? Is our government serious to tackle it, or is this lockdown helping us to control it? Thank you, sir.
Okay, one thing we see that, India is very big country. So this disease is also moving from one part to another part. Now, some parts like Delhi, for example, Bombay, Chennai, it has eased, but is now moving to south and east and so on. So one thing, actually, I have been taking this position that did we really need, this kind of severe lockdown, especially when we didn't even have the disease to that extent, because the harm the lockdown has done to us probably is much more serious. We are never really going to get statistics about how many people died because of lockdown. We don't have a system of collecting that kind of data, but we have to somehow live with the disease and ease the conditions for people to work. So both things have to go hand in hand. Like India, many countries actually have suffered quite a bit. I mean, US, many countries in Europe other than Germany, now in Latin America and South Africa, India, and so on, because of the severity of the lockdown. But some countries which have not really done that kind of lockdown, Germany, Japan, Russia, China, and so on, they are doing much better and so on. So sure, I mean, the disease is there and we don't know what's going to happen in the future, but you have to tackle both these issues simultaneously. I mean, you can't focus just on the one thing, because in a country like India, millions of people actually, I mean, live hand to mouth. I mean, they have suffered so much loss of job, loss of income, loss of everything and so on. Loss of medical facilities. How many people die because they couldn't get medical care? So, I mean, these are the issues which have to be looked into. You can't just focus on one problem. There, if you have several things, so all problems have to be given attention. Okay.
Yes. Thank you, Professor. There is one more question for you, Professor Upadhyay, from Aru. Aru is asking that during the 1930s Great Depression and the Keynesian prescription of following an expansionary monetary and fiscal policy. So he's asking, as we are facing right now depression because of the COVID-19 pandemic crisis, is it acceptable to go back and follow the same Keynesian prescription of 1930s, or we need like new way to deal with the crisis?
No, in many places, like I mentioned in my talk, USA, for example, and even now there was a recently, I mean, discussion going in Europe. So they're using these policies, fiscal policies, monetary policies. In my paper, I emphasize that the use of monetary policy to this extent is really has never happened before. And the level of printing of money, meaning, I mean, without any regard to what's happening in the real economy, I mean, that could have repercussions domestic as well as international. But one issue that we are facing is that, like in developing countries, like I'm talking particular about India, we have not really done anything about that kind of thing. We don't really have any capacity to use fiscal policy in terms of printing money or having high fiscal deficit and so on. So we are going to suffer much more. I mean, even America, I mean, we don't know. The situation can continue for 1 or 2 years. I mean, this depression kind of situation. But in India, at least they're trying to do something. I mean, they're using monetary policy to that extent and fiscal use of fiscal policy. But in our case, we have not. We are still, I mean, not able to see that can we increase the fiscal deficit, can we make use of this mechanism of printing of money or not, and so on. So our government has hardly done anything. I mean, they announced this huge package of 20 lakh crore and so on. But so many people, I mean, immediately pointed out that it was only 1 or 2 lakh crore worth of what they were talking about. So our situation is very, very serious compared to Europe and America, because they have at least some means, I mean, of doing something, providing help to people in terms of unemployment benefits and providing wages in Germany, for example. But in our case, nothing. Like we have seen what has happened to the migrant labor. Millions of people have gone to villages where there's no work. So all these people have lost all what they have gained in last 20, 30 years. So this is, so what policies, I mean, it does not seem the government is doing anything at all. And one more thing, we may never really know that what is the extent of damage to economy we have done, because our methods of measurements are very, very bad actually. So they may keep saying, okay, that our economy has not suffered so much, but in reality, things could be very, very, I mean, so worse like that.
Yeah, thank you. Question for Professor Ritusha. Ashima is asking, what action is needed to bridge the digital gap divide in the educational sector in India?
Okay. Okay. I saw that question as commonly addressed to all of us. We know that according to the latest NSS report on social consumption expenditure, which came out in 2017-18, only 23.8% of Indian households have access to the internet. And this number further declines if you add Indian households with students who should have access to internet to around 12.5%. We also have reports by Simons in 2020, which says that in India, more than 50% of people with fixed broadbands have very poor internet connections at home, and about 3% of people face cable cuts, 32% have a signal problem, and 11.4% have power issues. So it's a very bad connectivity in that sense. Even for the people who are using mobile internet, around 40% face poor connections. So if you look at India currently, the required infrastructure to teach its students digitally is simply lacking. We do need stronger interventions in terms of infrastructural capacity building to provide uninterrupted internet connections and electronic devices to students if we want to narrow digital divide. Perhaps one of the steps can be learning from other countries, which can be useful, and some similar initiatives that those countries have already successfully implemented can be taken up, depending, of course, on a different kind of state capacity on which we work, whereby collaboration with private service providers is necessary. I think one of the examples is providing tablets and internet access, which basically started in Coachella in California in 2016. Which basically greatly benefited the marginalized students. The graduation rate in that area basically increased by 10%. Such interventions can be replicated in India, of course, with a public-private partnership, with the kind of working with the kind of state capacity we have. We know that such interventions, which are basically targeted towards the marginalized section, receive an overwhelmingly positive response from students, and also encourage many other cities, regions within the country to sort of come with innovative measures to tackle this kind of a digital divide. India also represents a big opportunity in terms of manufacturing digital equipment that can be used specifically for educational services, as it serves the twin purpose of indigenous manufacturing and also bridging the digital gap. So internet services in India are amongst the cheapest in the world as of now. Hence, the provision for internet will be cheaper. Given that kind of a possibility, a push for digital literacy is also very necessary for in both manufacturing and service provisions, which can lead to a perhaps meaningful change in e-educational space. Probably other panelists want to add to this. Thank you.
Thank you, Professor Yusha, for there is one more general question by Gaurav Bhatia. He is asking, can India create its own Hong Kong in Lakshadweep? I'm sorry if I'm pronouncing Indian names wrong. Islands, Andaman Islands, or a similar location with similar benefits to the country. So, what do you think?
You want me to handle that question?
It is a general question, so if whoever would like.
I'm not even very sure what is supposed to be meant by creating one's own Hong Kong. I mean, if you look at Lakshadweep or Andaman Nicobar in relation with India, and if you look at China and Hong Kong, the two are simply not comparable. To posit these strategically very important, nonetheless totally undeveloped islands as equivalent to Hong Kong is again not possible. So it's a futuristic question in that sense, and whether they can develop as hubs of economic growth and so on and so forth in next 50 years. I don't know. I mean, that's a question which is rather far-fetched in my opinion, and I would rather not really have a kind of long-lasting prognosis in that direction. So for me, the two cases are simply not comparable. I'll stop myself there. Yeah, thank you.
We have to pray God now to pass the COVID-19 pandemic, and then we'll think about this in future. So there is also one general question. It is from Harsh. He's asking, will China look towards Iran and escalate their cooperation because both are having disputes with USA? Are you seeing this question? So what can be commented on watching the current scenario? So it is a general question.
I can take up this.
Yes, sure.
Yeah, I mean, their reports actually are not confirmed and that there is already some kind of agreement which has to be approved by the bodies, I mean, the legal bodies in Iran, that China is entering into an agreement with Iran of a very big size, $400 billion over 25 years and so on. I mean, this seems coming because many countries are really under so much pressure from US. I mentioned in my talk names of Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, places like that. I mean, they are almost under attack. I mean, you can't imagine the situation, kind of situation, the people, and even China and Russia. So you put all these countries together. These countries feel that every day there's something going on. There's under severe attack from the US side. So naturally, I mean, if this goes on, so that will definitely mean that these countries might really try to come near each other, come together. That is the only way they can deal with this problem of US, if I can say, imperialism. Because otherwise, if they don't really come together, so then individually, one by one, I mean, they can be hurt very badly.
One last question is from Gravita. It is for Professor Sriparna and Professor Upadhyay. She's saying that both of you have mentioned that internal disturbances have restricted nations in past to emerge as hegemony. Do you think that China's internal problems will be affected if, despite the fact that its economy is rebooting? And if yes, how so?
Economy,
I think there is
the question, economy is what?
Do you think that China's internal problems will be affected?
Because of?
Because of the internal problems that they have.
No, all countries have internal problems, and China also has a good share of it. We also have a good share of it. Like we have problems, if you want to count, actually so many. Last 6-7 months, we have seen that from Kashmir to CA, anti-CA, all kinds of things actually we also have. So similarly, China also has. China has problems in Hong Kong, in Tibet, with respect to Taiwan, and so on, South China Sea. But I really don't think that, I mean, these are the things which China will not be able to manage. I see that they have quite a strong leadership, and I have this impression that the society is organized, society is united. So somehow, I mean, this is a phase, and this phase is not really a short phase. This may even go for 10 years and so on. This war, I mean, in various forms, in trade form and other forms, and this may actually accelerate and so on. So ultimately, you have to see that how, I mean, things develop internationally. This is a question which can't be answered today because, as I mentioned in my paper, if more desperate US becomes, seeing the decline in its position and so on, aggression on the part of US may increase. So, I mean, future is obviously unknown and so on. But I mean, I suppose China will have capacity to handle these questions.
Just to add to that, there's been this talk that the Chinese bubble will burst, and this is not just from now itself or not just during the trade war, but this has been there since the 1990s and the 2000s, or the hope that, China's economy will become, a liberal Western democracy following capitalism. none of that has happened. There are these, it keeps coming up in spurts over and over again that the Chinese bubble is going to burst. It hasn't burst so far. It has withered a lot of economic problems. It has withered a lot of political problems. One thing about China is, love it or hate it, the thing is, Chinese planning is extremely astute, and they take a very long-term planning. So even if you look at their policy documents, they would be planning for 2050 from right now itself, right? Or their centenary celebrations for the establishment of the CCP. So planning is done very rigorously, and a long-term planning is done. So all of these problems which emerge, be it in Xinjiang, be it this secessionism threat that they call, or the three evils that they call in China, there'll be Tibet, there'll be Taiwan, there'll be Hong Kong. There are a lot of other issues in China as well. But the thing is, because of their planning, because of their capabilities for governance, which include surveillance, they have withered all sorts of storms so far, and they will be able to wither the storm even in the near future. Will that affect their economic growth? See, of course, they will have to pay a certain amount of attention, which they could have paid on their own economic growth. But that doesn't mean that, their economic rise will get curtailed in any way. I have a strong feeling that despite all of these problems, they'll be able to control them, the way secessionism from Xinjiang has been contained in those re-education camps. So the economy is not going to suffer a severe setback because of the domestic political turmoils that are happening. And if China can manage its international relations well, if it can ensure that there's a stable and peaceful international order, then the possibilities of it leveraging IR to unleash its export-led economic growth model all over again, then the possibilities increase. If not, then, well, we should just wait and watch what happens next.
Thank you for your answering that last question. I see that Dr. Filpus, you are asking to ask one more question.
Yes, thank you for giving me an opportunity. I have a question for Professor Ritisha Tiwari. Actually, due to this COVID-19 pandemic, we are facing human rights violation across the globe. But I am talking about India, where people have faced the challenges like right to life, right to work, right to have a political view. These, problems of human rights violation in India, it is increasing day by day. How dangerous it is for a country, big country, democratic country like India, and is India as a state following any steps to count down these violations? If it is, or if it is not, how dangerous are these violations, and how can we correct these problems? Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I quite agree with your proposition in the sense that human rights violations are on the increase. It's not as if it was not the case before the pandemic. We know that every time there is a strong majoritarian government that comes in the center, the tendency to have more violations in terms of human rights or having a very centralized authoritarian outlook of state governance emerges. And that has been the case in terms of India as well. Having said that, the pandemic has sort of given a free chit, as it were, to the state to act on all accounts out of its free will, with lesser and lesser checks and balances. So in that case, the human right violation also increases. And this is a case not just with India, with most of the countries, where a very centralized authoritarian take on how the state should be responding to any kind of protest, to the kind of civil rights movements and civil liberties has completely undergone a sea change, irrespective of the kind of regime that is there in that particular country. And this is across the globe. This is very much so in South Asia. This is very much so in India. So what can we do to counter it? Perhaps this is the time for civil rights movement to not cow down under the pressure of a very centralized regime, be it in India or be it anywhere else. The role of civil society, as it were, becomes preeminent. The civil society voices need to be very, very vigilant with not just regards to human rights, but also a lot of other accountability issues. Civil society basically has to sort of reimagine, recalibrate itself, and also ask for greater accountability from the government. Whether beyond that something can be there as a course correction, perhaps more emphasis by the states on retaining the federal nature of polity is required. So in that sense, most of the parties which are having governments in different states also need to rise to this occasion and provide a kind of counterbalancing, bulwark against a more centralized federal central regime. So yeah, that's my response. No, not adequate, but I hope that it suffices in some manner.
We are having the last hand that is raised from Dr. Jaskaran. So this is going to be our last question. So please unmute yourself, Dr. Jaskaran, and ask your question.
Thank you, Hiba, for this opportunity. My question is for Professor Upadhyay. Sir, how this pandemic is going to affect Indian federal structure, especially for economic aspect? And as it is in trend that Indian state is going to be centralized, and how this pandemic is going to affect Indian federal structure? Thank you.
Basically, we have to look at the question of economy. I mean, all center states all are suffering, and the question of not being able to collect enough taxes and so on. If we don't have taxes, then how do we share? So all, our federal requirements, like we had some assumptions about GST, that we will collect so much GST, we will give so much to the state, compensation and so on. Suppose like they were not getting enough taxes, the center was supposed to compensate them and so on. All these questions are open actually. And the major problem is that, we are not even, don't even appear to be serious about these questions. Like how much the economy will suffering, how people are doing and so on. These are not the things actually which we talk about. All of a sudden, last 1 month actually, there's so much fake news about China, India, and so on, all kinds of things. So we debate and devote so much attention to so many other things. So the problem is that obviously economic hardships are there, states are going to suffer. Money is not there, center is not having money, states are not having money. So how will money go to state? All these questions are open questions. And the point I want to make is that actually it's not that this problem has ended. This may only be beginning actually. The repercussions of this crisis, we may say for several years, 2-3 years and so on. So how, we devise methods to better our life of our people, 50-60% of people, whose position we know, they not even have proper meals and so on, that kind of condition. So these questions are open questions, but our government, our politicians, even our state governments don't seem to be paying any attention to these problems.
Okay, thank you so much, professors, for your patience today and answering all these questions. So before ending this thought-provoking, excellent sessions that our center had today, I would like to send a special vote of thanks to our very special panelists for today, Professor Upadhyay and Professor Sriparna and Professor Ritusha, for accepting our invitation and being here and being patient to answer all the questions. So by the name of Jindal Centre for the Global South, I really appreciate accepting and being giving and sharing with us your knowledge and experience. So thank you all professors, and thanks for all our participants for joining us, and we look forward to join us in future webinars and sessions as well. Thank you.